¿Listo? Just for everyone who's in the room, so there is the Zoom, so we're being recorded, and we'll have a microphone to go around when it comes to, sorry, I'm being directed to speak more. Okay, good morning to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us in person, and also for those of you who are joining us on Zoom. We're very grateful that you're spending your time with us. I know we're in the middle of a very important World Cup match. So we're especially grateful. And Jorge and I just stepped away from watching, and it's 0-0 at halftime. So hopefully there'll be some scores while we're discussing democracy. So my name is Rebecca Bill Chavez. I'm president and CEO of the Inter-American Dialogue. And I'm really excited to be having this conversation with Jorge Castañeda. Jorge, as I was thinking about this, I realized I've known you for over 30 years, which is actually a reflection of how old we are now. But it's just, we're so grateful. So I think everyone here in the room and also on Zoom are probably either know Jorge or familiar with his bio. So I'm not going to waste too much time going over it. But I just want to highlight what I think are three very prominent facets of Jorge's career. One of them is just his role as an intellectual and a thought leader when it comes to inter-American relations, when it comes to politics of Latin America and the Caribbean. And just his profile as an author as well. I think many of us have his books on our shelves, and even just yesterday, your commentary on Peru. So I think that's one really key role. The other is sort of the politician, public servant bin. And Jorge, which includes time as Mexico's foreign minister under Vicente Fox. And then finally, his role as an educator. I think this is one of your greatest legacies so far and in your career, but just highlighting to students the importance of Latin America and the Caribbean. And really, I just think I've met many of your former students, and I should say I'm one of them, who have been really turned on to the region and its importance because of you. And you've taught everywhere from Princeton to UNAM to now you're teaching at NYU and Sciences Po. So that's another, I just think, a super impactful part of your career. So today we're going to have the opportunity to hear Jorge's thoughts about the future of democracy in the region. I know this is something that's in all of our minds, but the challenges and hopefully some bright spots as well. We'll also hear Jorge's thoughts. I'm hoping that we can have a chance to talk about US policy towards the region. We all know that starting with the campaign, the Biden administration has committed to not only renewing democracy here at home in the United States, but also helping to renew democracy across the world, including Latin America. I really look forward to hearing your assessment of that. But bottom line is I've asked Jorge to be provocative. I think we all expect nothing less. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Jorge.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you for having me here, and thank you for the opportunity to see a lot of friends and old friends and new friends. It's an honor to be here. You have so many virtues that I won't even thank you for all of them, but you do have one serious defect, and that is it's unfixable, incurable. Having been a student of mine, that doesn't get fixed. That's forever, and it's terrible. So you have all of the vices and deformations that come from that. They go back a long time. I'll speak a few minutes in general about where I think the situation is regarding prospects or the reality of democracy in Latin America today, and then maybe just focus on two or three specific cases, and we can come back to them, I'm sure, in the discussion. A little book that that I just published in Spanish called La Nueva Soledad de América Latina with Ricardo Lagos and Héctor Aguilar Camín. One of the issues mainly that Lagos brings up is that there is a structural issue involved, which is not that different from other regions of the world, rich or poor, or richer or poorer. which is that policy is slow and complicated and contradictory and full of obstacles and difficulties everywhere in Latin America. It's just not easy to get things done. But people, because of social media, because of the growing middle class, because of international exposure, globalization, for all these reasons that we're all familiar with, want everything done right away. And this makes it very difficult for presidents like Lagos or his friends, his colleagues, and others of us who have been in government even for a short while, to manage this contradiction. It's increasingly difficult for anybody to do. And this is something that Latin American democracies are not really ready to face. It's a challenge that I don't know if anybody else is, but certainly in Latin America, we are not. So that's a first issue there. A second one is the famous sort of revolution, if you want. They used to call it when I was a student, of rising expectations. But you know, Lagos, again, in this book, brings it up very intelligently. He says every now and then he visits these single home projects, or fraccionamientos, we call them in Mexico. I don't know what they're called in Chile. Very small houses, but they're houses, real houses, small, but that he built or had built when he was president. And he goes and talks to the people, and he expects to be thanked and that everybody's going to be very happy to see him, blah, blah, blah. And they're all pretty upset at him. And he asks them why. He says, well, you know, you gave me this house, but I have nowhere to park my car. And so Lagos says, well, yeah, but when I gave you the house, I didn't think you'd ever have a car. Well, the guy has a car, and actually the guy's probably going to have 2 cars soon. So he's going to be doubly pissed off because he can't park either of the 2 cars. And this is another big challenge, which is real. The middle classes are increasingly demanding in Latin America, and they're not getting what they want. The pandemic was a real uncovering, or whatever you want to call it, of Latin American welfare state nakedness, in the sense that everybody was able to see that the healthcare system, the education system, the housing situation, the security situation, connectivity, et cetera, were terrible. With a couple of exceptions, they were generally terrible. And this is another challenge which is right there, and which appears more clearly today perhaps than it did before the pandemic. The situation's the same, nothing changed, but you couldn't see it, or you couldn't see it as well. And then finally, you have the institutional problems, which are increasingly real. The Chileans thought initially that they could fix the traditional Latin American presidential regime or system with their constitutional convention. They gave up on it pretty quickly. They made a mess of it in general terms anyway, but one of the things that they didn't do, which is a pity, was try and get into the discussion of finding ways to leave behind or change or adjust the presidential system to the growing diversity of their societies, to the excess number of political parties, et cetera, either with a hybrid system. They wanted to have a discussion on moving to a parliamentary system or to a hybrid system. It didn't work. They didn't work out. They weren't able to do it. They got caught up in too many other things in the Constitution. It was a big disaster all around. But this discussion has not taken place. It is not taking place practically anywhere in Latin America. And some of the consequences are present, for example, in the Peruvian case. I mean, there are a bunch of explanations for what happened in Peru yesterday and what's happened the last 6 years, but one of them is a very defective, although promising, institutional arrangements. You know, Peru is perhaps, I think, I may be mistaken, but many can correct me here, the only country in Latin America that doesn't have a pure presidential system. It's the only one that is not, that has some kind of hybrid situation, and it's been pretty much of a disaster. On the other hand, it's promising in that sense that at least there was an attempt there. So is democracy in danger? Well, the bright spots that Rebecca wanted me to mention, I will. Bright spot, clearly Brazil worked out well, better than expected, not the result, but the way institutions responded to the challenge brought about by Bolsonaro's challenge. I think that that is something that we can be happy about. Although clearly the danger is there and it's going to continue to be there. And I don't think it's behind us completely. I think in a way, we can come back to this, the Peruvian response to what happened yesterday has also been a relatively encouraging one in that the institutions seem to have worked, at least for now. But remember always what Chavez said after his attempted coup in 1992, por ahora. Remember, some of you may remember his speech on television. And we learned what por ahora meant. There are other cases. I mean, the Constituent Assembly in Chile was a disaster, but at the same time, it's an interesting exercise. I mean, not everybody is able to take, 1/10 of the population demonstrating and protesting in the streets and transform it into a deliberative process and drafting a new constitution. They drafted a lousy constitution, but they could have drafted a good one. They weren't condemned to screw it up. And the fact that they were able to channel all that energy in the streets and the protests and the discontent into something in principle constructive, I think was also a bright spot, regardless of the actual result right now. So if you like, Rebecca, I'll stop here. There are many non-bright spots, and I'm sure we'll get to them, particularly in the case of Mexico. But I'll stop here so that we can get into these other issues with more detail, if that's okay.
Well, since you mentioned Mexico, I'm going to take the opportunity to ask you about that. Your assessment of what's going on in Mexico under AMLO. We've seen some, when it comes to the rule of law, judicial independence, issues about the freedom of the press, freedom of civil society, the electoral process. So I'd love to hear your assessment of that. And also US, we haven't heard a lot from the Biden administration about some of the challenges to democracy in Mexico. And I'd love maybe even some recommendations that you would make to the Biden administration.
I'm pretty sure they're totally not interested in in hearing them. But I mean, the problem is, as you all know, that 4 years into his term, with a little less than 2 years left, nothing terrible has happened in the sense that, individual freedoms have not been restricted. It hasn't dissolved the Congress, it hasn't closed down newspapers, hasn't disbanded the Supreme Court. Compared to that, it has not been a disaster. But compared to what we had in Mexico when he began, I think the regression is very significant. And the point I'd like to most emphasize is the militarization, because everything else probably can be fixed. So there are only, I don't know how many members, 4 members of the Federal Competition Commission, and he hasn't appointed the other 3, and the Supreme Court said he had to appoint them, and maybe he won't, blah, blah, blah. Okay, that can be fixed. At some point, you just name the 3. Next president names them, and we are now clearly, we can see the horizon. It's only a year and a half away when he leaves, so it's not that serious. The army, or the military in general, is a bigger problem, because these guys are not going to go away that simply. From the easiest stuff. I just went to the Guadalajara Book Fair this weekend, and I flew from Atlanta to Guadalajara, so I went through the international arrivals area in Guadalajara. And although in principle, it's in Mexico City, the Navy runs customs, and elsewhere, theoretically, the Army runs customs. But in Guadalajara, which is a big place, the National Guard, the new National Guard runs customs. Now, it's very difficult. You know, when you go through customs and the National Guard guy opens up your luggage, you know you're going to lose something. You might lose the suitcase. You might lose the content of the suitcase. You might lose the content and the suitcase, but you know you're going to lose something. The guy is infinitely corrupt by definition. That's what they are in the National Guard. They're newly created. They come from the army. They come from the police. They are corrupt, period. There's no discussion possible about it. How do you get that guy to leave customs when he is making a small fortune every month? You guys don't remember this, but we had this two cute things about customs in Mexico under Echeverria. Maybe Jerónimo remembers. He's young, but you know about it. So first, you know, Echeverria was desperate about what to do with customs at the airport in Mexico City. So he put cameras. Like the next day, there was a little cardboard thing on the lens, and so that didn't work out. But then he had the Chilean exiles, all of the Chileans who came after the Allende coup. And he figured, rightly so, that the Chileans were honest and serious people like Vivanco. I mean, you know, you can trust a guy like Vivanco, right? Okay. So he hired the Chileans and put them in the customs area. One day, a very famous Mexican singer, I think it was Lola Beltran, but I might be mistaken. They're very famous, or it may have been Maria Felix or Dolores del Rio, whatever. She arrived with, you know, 1,000 suitcases full of everything. And the Chileans stopped her. And they searched her, and they began confiscating all this stuff. The next day, of course, they were all fired. Reasonably enough. I mean, you work at customs, you know, Mexico is Mexico. It's not Chile. All right, so the army is now in a series of positions where it's going to be very difficult to get them out. It's not just what they're constructing. For example, the Mayan train proceeds, of which there probably will be none, already have a dedicated assignment attribution to the Army's pension fund. Now, I don't think there's any money to be made there, but you never know. And besides, there are ways of channeling money there. So how do you take that away from the Army? How do you take the airport, the new airport, away from the Army? Because there's a lot of money. I mean, huge, huge sums, all for them. How do you take the budget away from them with the National Guard, which is part of the Army? How do you take everything there away from them? That, I think, is the greatest threat that we're facing in Mexico. And by the way, I strongly suggest that you read Tim Golden's piece in the New York Times Magazine that comes out this next Sunday on the Cienfuegos affair, case or something. Because if you had doubts, and I had doubts, I think Jerónimo also may have had doubts about whether Cienfuegos really was involved in everything that the Americans accused him of. After reading the piece, I think you have less doubts, fewer doubts. Yeah, I think so. It just came out today, no? The book, I just saw it advertised today. But I mean, Golden really went into an enormous amount of detail into this. It's a very long piece in the magazine. It's done with ProPublica. And I mean, and these guys, the current army, they're all pretty much disciples of Cienfuegos. They all worked with him. He was their mentor. Mexico's a problem.
So you make the point about, I mean, when Calderon started to rely on the military more heavily in 2006, it was supposed to be a short-term solution to address the crime and violence in Mexico. And here we are in 2022. And it's interesting because AMLO, as you know, I think everyone in this room knows, when he ran, his campaign stressed that he was going to get the military out of this law enforcement role. And now it's, like you say, it's complete. the National Guard now, it's been officially shifted. It was already heavily militarized, and it's now officially shifted to Sedena. So really appreciate your comments on that. And the point is, are we at the point of no return? Which brings me to an issue.
Well, you want, go ahead.
Well, I just
because you want to come back to the Biden administration.
Yeah, so on that, I want to come back because we haven't heard a lot about this from the administration, and I think one of the concerns, those of us who might have had some criticisms of the Trump administration, was the fact that Trump, there's this transactional approach, right? So the idea that the United States was kind of silent on issues such as democracy, because Mexico was helping us when it comes to migration. I'd love to hear your assessment about how that it has or has not changed under Biden.
Well, in a sense, I think it's exactly the same policy, except by different people, which is more worrisome. In other words, it's as long as they do the dirty work at the Mexican southern border, we'll put up just about with anything the Mexicans do. And B, we're not going to do anything to generate any kind of instability in Mexico or that could conceivably bring instability. Political, economic, social, et cetera. That's the Cienfuegos case, for example. Trump and his people and Barr didn't cave on Cienfuegos because of migration. They caved because they were scared to death that the Mexican army would be terribly upset, and God knows what it would do if this went forward. The article doesn't get into who intervened, but clearly somebody here spoke to Barr and said something. So in that sense, on the two pillars, it's the same policy. Now, I think the Biden people they don't have to go that far. This notion that you can't say anything publicly to López Obrador because he'll get hysterical and he's kind of crazy, so God knows what he's going to do. That's not a good enough reason. It's a good enough reason for not doing something drastic. But just saying every now and then, hey, this is not a great idea. Hey, watch out for the press, watch out for the Supreme Court, watch out for the Electoral Institute, et cetera. There is no reason why the Biden people can't do that. They can't go much further. For example, I don't know, I'm sure people here know more than I do about this. My sense is that on the USMCA consultations and panels, the Biden people will cave. There will be no panels. I think State Department and NSC will eventually get involved, if not, they're already not involved, and say, no nonsense. Mexico is too important and too dangerous a place to fool around with tariffs. And I think they'll cave. And that would be reasonable. I mean, it's a few $1 billion of American investment in Mexico are not worth the risk of slapping tariffs on a Mexican economy that is on the brink anyway. My sense is they'll cave. That's reasonable. But why can't Blinken make a clear statement, for example, on the National Electoral Institute? Why not? What is the problem there? Well, AMLO will get upset. So what? I mean, we have two Mexican ambassadors in Washington. Well, we have a third one, but he's currently, we have two. We have Esteban Moctezuma, and we have Ken Salazar. I mean, he was ratified by the Mexican Congress as Mexico's ambassador to the United States. He is not the American ambassador in Mexico. He's the Mexican ambassador here, and he does a very good job. But what else do they need? So anyway, that's a little bit my thoughts on this particular issue.
I promised you he'd be provocative. So why don't we open it up to questions? I have some coming in online. So for those of you who are watching this online, please use the Zoom Q&A function for your questions, or you can send an email to meetings@thedialogue.org. So I think we'll go back and forth. I saw that Mark already has his hands up. Mark, we're going to bring a microphone to you for your question.
Thank you. as always. Good to see you. I want to just follow up on the same line on INE. Is it your view that AMLO is going to succeed in essentially dissolving INE and having elected members of a new electoral tribunal? And or is there enough opposition within Mexican society to that it will not happen? And second, on your point about Blinken, I'm less concerned about the public statement as I am about whether or not very strong private statements from not just Blinken, but from Biden as well could have any kind of impact on AMLO's thinking on that.
On the first point, Mark, my sense is that AMLO has lost this battle. That ship has sailed and it didn't happen. The PRI Congress people were able to resist the threat of being thrown in jail, especially the head of the PRI. And not that he doesn't necessarily deserve to go to jail, that's a different issue, but he managed to escape that. And so I think he will maintain that position, and that will not happen anymore. Now, what they're trying to do is to reduce the budget, to have them make a series of internal adjustments, which are not that important, according to the current head of the Institute, who thinks that he has enough money for next year, at least anyway, to run things properly. And for 24, well, they'll see when they get there. But so I'm not that worried anymore about the INE because AMLO lost that battle, but he could have won it. I mean, it was very tight. And you know, it's still, the way they work this is that there's I guess you would call it an impeachment committee in Congress that removes the immunity from congressional members. And it's made up of 4 people, 2 from Morena, 1 from the PRI, and 1 from the PAN. So they're tied, and so they can't remove the PRI leader's immunity, so they can't throw him in jail, at least in principle. Now, if one of the 2 guys of the opposition, the PRI guy or the PAN guy, is also threatened by being sent to jail, then one of those guys could change their vote, then that would be 3-1, then he would lose his immunity, then he goes to jail. Or he comes to the United States like Anaya, but he's got to hurry up. I mean, it's a quick connection there. He's got to, okay, so that's, you know, my sense, Mark, and I've told this to many American friends, AMLO does not care about private communications from the United States government or any other government. He's totally uninterested, and what he does is very skillful, he's very intelligent. He says, yeah, I had a very good conversation with President Biden. He was very supportive. He's a great supporter of Mexican democracy. He's all in and very respectful of Mexican sovereignty, dignity, respect. Wonderful guy. We had a great conversation. Thank you. And he dares Biden to say the contrary. So far, Biden and Trump before him, but certainly Biden has not been willing to respond to that, or Blinken, or Sullivan, or any of these guys. They all cave when he says what they said. It's a very strange thing, Jerónimo. I had never seen anything like this. I mean, you know, the Mexican president says what the Americans said. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. And he dares them to contradict him, to say, no, that's not true. That's not what happened. Sorry, I told him blah, 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 blah. Biden is not unwilling to do that. So any private communication, I think, is idle. It's useless, I think, quite honestly.
For those of you who didn't hear that are watching on Zoom, former Ambassador Gutierrez just made the point that AMLO is actually very clever. I mean, his approach to the United States has been nothing short of brilliant, basically. Maybe not brilliant. Yeah.
I wouldn't go that far, Rebecca, but I think that people thought that, that his relation with Trump would explode, and it didn't. It worked out pretty well for both sides. I was actually a little bit jealous in some regard, because we got the best, the worst from the Trump administration, and he got treated pretty decently. And the same is happening. I don't think it's sustainable, because beyond the narrative, there's a lot going on that's it's bound to explode. I think some of the things, you can't leave a narrative always. But in the way that I think, it's right to give him some credit to the way he's handled his relation, but he's missing opportunities also. I'll say that, and this is your conference, but the problem is he understood the relationship, the importance and the necessity of a good relation with the United States. As Jorge was saying, as compared to what, a few years ago, he was adamantly against free trade and NAFTA, and then suddenly he's a big, he was smart in take that tack. He has never seen or will see the relationship as an opportunity. That's a big miss, I think.
No, just to give you an example of what Karen was saying, what I tried to make, he has now said several times that there will be a North American summit in Mexico City on January 9th. The White House has still not confirmed it. It may or may not happen. I suppose it will happen, but I have no idea. But he dares them to say no, and they don't. He dares Trudeau also, who can't stand him. And Trudeau just sort of sits there and says, well, maybe I'll go to Mexico, maybe I won't, maybe it'll be on the 9th, maybe it won't be, maybe this, maybe that, Trudeau has enough problems with Xi. I don't think he wants to get dressed down by AMLO too, but that's what's happening.
So we have a question now from Alex Valderrama.
Hi, everyone. Alex Valderrama with Chevron. I truly appreciate everything that's been said on Mexico, but I think we need to just highlight what that implies and has implied to the private sector. For all of us here, it has been a ton of work just working with our government for them to step up and defend all U.S. investors in Mexico. It has been really, really hard, but it has happened. When Secretary Granholm spoke with her counterpart with Nale, things started shifting in the right direction. Also, after like 18 months, the USTR's finally pushed towards consultation process, right, for USMCA. So it's been really, really hard. So if the US government says nothing publicly, fine with us, as long as they're working and continue to work with us behind the scenes to get things, to do the right thing. So I'm just hoping that when you have the chance to get that message, if they don't want to rock the boat because of migration, trafficking, all those other things that are happening, shouldn't downplay all the trade and investment and all the activities that have just stopped or are on hold because of decisions that haven't been made.
I agree with you. I think, obviously I'm not sure, I have no information about it. I think they will drag out the consultations, kick the can down the road, and sort of run out the clock until the next government in Mexico. I don't think they will either reach an agreement on the law. They may reach agreement on specific permits and stuff, but on the law, I don't think they will change it, and I don't think USTR will go for the panel. They'll just wait until 24. That's my impression, but I have no information to that effect. Just an impression.
Thank you. Jose Miguel Villabanco has a questions.
Yeah, a quick one. I'm here actually as a senior fellow of Council of Foreign Relations. Jorge, can you elaborate a little bit more about the militarization of Mexico, but not just militarization? What concerns me is the politicization of the armed forces. So the fact that you have Secretary of Defense, for instance, of Mexico, supporting publicly the ruling party, the government, AMLO, and so on. Do you see any lasting effect, impact within the armed forces of Mexico?
My sense, Jose Miguel, is that that's not, it would take them more time. The Mexican army has been deliberately kept out of politics through corruption, weakness, poor training, poor equipment for the last, well, for 80 years since it exists, since Cárdenas, more or less. And it would take more than just one administration to politicize them, I think. They don't really care. I mean, they have been marginalized from politics for 80 years now, practically. And as long as they can keep doing what they do, I don't think they're interested in taking power. The system worked. It worked very well. And I think it continues to work. Now, the problem, of course, is that they are now penetrating into areas of national life where it's more difficult to be totally apolitical, where there's a risk. I mean, you know, the airport, the train, the isthmus, the National Guard, the bank branches, customs, the ports. It's a lot of stuff. But my impression is that they're still not, they don't like power. They like other stuff. That's the way they've been trained for 80 years, and it's worked very well. And I'm sorry that since Calderón, they began, US and Mexican presidents began giving them money, giving them toys, giving them training. I think it's a pity. They shouldn't have done it. You know, keep them without toys, without money, without training. So they don't know how to write a manifest. They still don't know. If you read the stuff that's come out now, the Guacamaya, it's marvelous because there is a real syntactic problem. I mean, significant syntaxis problems involved there. They don't know how to write. But write, I mean, that's not poetry. They don't know how to put two sentences together. And I think that's great. I'm very happy to have seen that because that's the kind of Mexican army I want. They don't know. They're not great at shooting either. I mean, but that's the kind of army I want. I've always wanted that kind of army, and we've had it. And that part is rather gratifying.
So I want to turn to a question that came in via Zoom, and it's, could you please give us your insights regards to China's economic development influence in Latin America? Let's talk about Latin America more broadly, and the challenges for US bilateral relations in the near future for the Biden-Harris administration. So let's, the China angle.
That's a very interesting one. And the first point, which I think a lot of people in the United States don't always see, and I think it's very important to emphasize, is that there's a very different relationship with China and with the US-China confrontation, depending on where you are in Latin America. North of the Panama Canal, it's one story. There is really not much of a relationship with China. There are very few commodity exports, very little investment. It's not a big deal. South, it's a completely different situation, and it's a big deal. And you know, the Americans are beginning, from what one can read in the press, that's all the information I have, beginning to get nervous about this stuff. With Chile, they've complained, this was still Pompeo, I think, on the fiber optic cable to Japan that wanted it to run through first to China, and the Americans went down and made a fuss, and they forced the Chileans to send it through Australia. With Brazil, they did the same thing with Huawei and the 5G connection, although a couple of people have said that the Brazilians decided to do it anyway, I'm not so sure. In Mexico, there's a public protest, it's public, by Salazar and by Todd Robinson about Mexico having bought the scanners for the 14 border points from a Chinese company instead of buying it from an American company, not so much as a protection issue as a contract issue, but rather because of the security of of the artifacts. So I think that there's a big difference between the North and the South. I think there is now, I wouldn't say a danger, but there is a greater possibility of Brazil becoming more pro-Chinese with Lula. He kind of invented the BRICS. He likes the BRICS. He's a big fan of this business. And I think that he will be tempted to flirt with the Chinese or go beyond flirting to really hook up with the Chinese much more than Bolsonaro, who didn't like them anyway. He ended up having to deal with them, but his first reaction, he didn't like them. I think there's a chance that things will get more complicated. And there's a debate in Latin America, there's beginning to be a debate. I think it should be a more intense debate about what Latin American countries should do given this new rivalry or confrontation. There's the Chileans, as you know, Jose Miguel, who have come up with this business of active non-alignment. Not always sure I know exactly what it means, but they have this notion. Go back to Mexico for a second. AMLO has been very intelligent on this. He has not played the China card until today. I mean, as of today, he hasn't. He may do so, but he hasn't yet. And I think that's been very wise of him because he could get into big trouble. But, you know, the United States, on the other hand, should have a clearer idea, perhaps, of where this is going to go and to what extent it's willing to do anything about it, if at all.
Interesting, because yesterday we had a conversation with Horacio Ladreta, who's one of the pre-candidates for Argentina in the Argentine presidential elections, and this topic came up, and there was someone asked him, well, you know, that you've got this Chinese space station, and now they're talking about a logistics hub in Ushuaia, and his response, I think, was he said, well, if you're worried about it, give us some alternatives. Yes, we want this hub, but if we don't want China to do it, where are the alternatives? I thought it was an important response for everyone to hear. Same with 5G. He made the same point with 5G. So I know Andrew Seeley and Michael both have a question. Andrew?
It's always fascinating. It's always fascinating. I don't think we're very far apart on this, but when Peña Nieto came in, we all thought, yes, it's likely that there could be some corruption, but he's going to do some good things. He's going to come in with some authority. Didn't really happen, with all due respect to people that were, close to him. But and with López Obrador, we thought, yes, there's some authoritarian tendencies, but it's time that the left perhaps have a voice in politics. He'll at least do some things. And what actually turns out, he's extraordinary as a politician. I mean, I don't think we've seen a leader as strong in the relationship vis-a-vis the U.S., in the relationship vis-a-vis the population since probably Salinas. But in terms of actually getting stuff done, it's really hard to sort of see what the change is here, right? I mean, this is not Lula in Brazil. It's not, the Frente Amplio in Uruguay. This is sort of going back to your days writing, about the left in Utopia Desarmada. That's still one of my favorite books. I mean, there's sort of not, and so what I wonder actually is what happens next. Is there anyone who follows him, assuming that Morena can repeat, which is a big if, of course, but assuming Morena repeats, it's not clear what the proposal is, and it's not clear there's anyone else like him out there. I mean, this is a personalistic project, right? I mean, is there a sort of a follow through that Mexico is changing in some dramatic way? I mean, I get the point on the army, I get the point on institutions, but it almost feels like Mexico is drifting once again.
Always,
right? Yes, it's almost this permanent drift, and this is sort of one more chapter in that permanent drift rather than a radical transformation, as much as it's made out to be.
I mean, I agree completely, Andrew. The transformation is not there, except somewhat on the negative side along the lines of the few things I described, and there are more. But in terms of, I wouldn't say positive, but an affirmative transformation that, okay, he has stopped doing A and started doing B. That's just not so practically in any area, with the exception of his 4 or 3.5 pilot projects or big iconic ambitions, the train, the airport, the refinery, and the transismic thing. That's half. They're really not that big deals, and no one knows if they'll ever be finished and if they'll be continued or not. The social programs are, it's very complicated to figure this out because the numbers are fuzzy. Nobody wants to work on it. Nobody wants to finance the people who work on it. So how many people are actually getting the stipends? The ones for the elderly, the ones for the original peoples, the ones for the handicapped, the ones for the students, the ones for the this, for the that. I mean, there's a little money for everybody, but nobody knows exactly how many people are receiving the money. And then nobody's been able to compare whether it's more money than before, or it's just the same money with a different name, or it's less money than before. And then there's the third issue on this, which is what has he done with the budgets of the health ministries or agencies and the education ministry compared to his social programs? Apparently, but that remains to be seen, he has cut the educational budget in real terms and cut the health and IMSS budget in real terms. And that money has been going to the projects plus to the programs. So there is none of this social transformation. It's just not there, or economic transformation, it's not there. Now, what's going to happen afterwards? Well, depending on the election, obviously, but at some point, people will realize that the Cuarta Transformación just never took place. There is no such animal. And the country is pretty much in the same shape it was in when he arrived. There's not that much of a change in economic and social terms. In political terms, I think there's an important regression, but not in economic and social terms, forward or backward. The one thing that I think the only one I want to mention for the future is that unless something different happens, he will be the first president since Lázaro Cárdenas, and maybe even more than Cárdenas, to leave office with a significant social constituency or mass base or whatever you want to call it. All of the other guys left in disgrace, or if not in disgrace, without any particular following. Even the ones who were more popular, less popular, but they had the trappings of power. They lost the trappings of power. They lost power. That was it. This guy will take with him X amount of people who are devoted to him. And we don't know what he's going to do with them. Is he going to mobilize them? Is he just going to go home and forget about them? Is he going to try and pressure whoever governs not to, shut down the little train? Just to take the silliest example, what if the next president, even if it's a Morena president, decides that the train's the stupidest thing? I mean, in a country where we do a lot of stupid things, this is probably the most stupid of all. So the next president, he decides to shut it down. What's he going to do? Is he going to bring out, 500,000 people in the streets of Mexico City, or he's just going to say, well, what the hell, who cares anyway? I have no idea, but I know he has the potential to do something about it if someone shuts down the train. The first president since Cárdenas to be able to do something. Cárdenas didn't. We don't know if he didn't. That's a discussion among historians, because he couldn't have, because he was very unpopular when he left anyway, or whether he didn't because he was a visionary, whether he was a statesman, he was a noble figure who decided that he didn't want to do that. I don't know which of the two is true, but for this guy, it can be very complicated.
Something else to worry about. That's actually a really helpful insight. Michael.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Jorge, for this. I want to bring you back to the sort of the crisis du jour, the Peru case. I read your article in Nexos and enjoyed it. You said the Peruvians handled this reasonably well, and I agree with that. But I want to ask you about what this says about Latin America, the responses, the reactions in Latin America. As far as I'm aware, and I've read, what Petro said, what AMLO said, what Boric said, what Lula said, what Fernandez said. Nobody has said this was an attempt at an autogolpe. And we condemn, and this is not acceptable in our region. We're not for autogolpes. Nobody said that. The United States did, and the EU did, but I don't see one government and that's what it was. This was a guy, and there are a lot of Peruvians who care about these things, who voted for Castillo, because preferable to Keiko in the election, and sort of saw the evidence of lots of corruption, 6 cases from the Fiscalia against him. And then it results in this autogolpe. I guess he thought maybe the military would back him, or he had more support. God knows what he was thinking. But he did this, and this is something, that's not supposed to happen in a sort of a democratic region. And I'm just wondering what your take is on that. Why was no government willing to say this was an autogolpe? That's not, and we condemn this in the strongest terms.
Yeah, I agree with you completely that I think it's disappointing. I saw Jose Miguel's statement yesterday, and I think that's he's not yet a government. I mean, sometimes he acts as if he were a government, but he's not. Not yet, but no, I agree. I mean, it's disappointing in the sense that, first of all, there was no clear-cut condemnation. I guess Lula's statement, in the sense that he was removed through constitutional procedures, is better than AMLO's statement that it's the fault of the elites, which is not untrue either. I mean, there's a certain degree of truth in that also. But I didn't find any radical condemnation, and I didn't see, for example, anybody calling a meeting of the Permanent Council of the OAS, or even if they like this CELAC business, or they could do CELAC. I mean, the Argentines, in theory, are the pro tempore chairman. They could call a meeting and whatever, condemn it, or saving Private Castillo, whatever they want to do. I mean, but they haven't wanted to do it. The other thing that I also find disappointing, regardless of CELAC or the OAS, is that there obviously is no common vision, even among the progressive leaders, about this. Some of them, are like AMLO a little bit. This is Evo Morales all over again. This is Salvador Allende all over again. The Americans did it. AMLO hasn't said that, but several people in his party have now said it openly yesterday and today. The Americans did it. And the proof is the US statement that you just quoted. The other guys, Boric has a more reasonable stance, just regretting, but it doesn't go beyond regretting the situation. Lamento mucho. Yeah, lamentar, we can all, I lamento a whole bunch of things in life. It's too cold outside. Lamento que haga frío. I mean, this is not very statesman-like stuff. And I think it's a real problem because things worked out okay. But what would have happened if the autogolpe had worked? Then what would have happened? Would they have called an OAS meeting and condemn it? Would they have invoked the Inter-American Charter? What would they have done if it had worked? And I mean, it could have gone either way. Apparently, the guy obviously is terribly unfit to govern and miscalculated, but he could have gotten it right. And then what? So I'm very disappointed in it also, but I think it reflects something that we've all been seeing the last few years, and even the first time around with the first pink tide or whatever, which is that there are untouchable things. Cuba's untouchable, Venezuela's untouchable, Nicaragua's untouchable. And now these other situations are beginning to become untouchable. And I mean, remember Petro's statement after the referendum in Chile, you know, this is Pinochet. I mean, exactly, no, absolutely. But there's a real problem there because unless these other issues are addressed differently, Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, every time something happens that could be assimilated to that or associated with it, we'll have this kind of reaction.
We have a question from Paula, and while we're waiting for the microphone, just something else maybe you could answer in addition to Paula's question is about, you mentioned OAS, CELAC, about the inter-American system, and perhaps is there some way to, if you were to make recommendations about how to strengthen its ability or its willingness even to defend democracy, I'd love to hear that.
Well, thank you, Jorge. My question is kind of connected to what Rebecca just said. What do you see as the future of this inter-American system under the new realities in the Americas? Because the pink wave, as you said, is trying to shift away from that inter-American system, which is under a strong US influence. And we would love to hear from you what the future entails.
I hope that there will be sufficient bickering among the members of the second pink tide that they will not be able to agree on any of this nonsense of doing away with the OAS and replacing it with CELAC and getting rid of the Americans and the Canadians and all this thing. Hopefully they'll continue to bicker like they did with the IDB, et cetera, and it won't work, but you never know. You know, Lula, for example, I think hates the Inter-American Human Rights Commission and court more than Maduro does. I mean, he really doesn't like them. AMLO considers them to be worse than the School of the Americas. I mean, practically the same thing. So the dislike is there. I mean, it's very vehement. Hopefully, it won't go that far, and at some point, either when his term expires or maybe for other reasons before then, Secretary General Almagro will leave. I mean, that happens. And then there's a possibility of finding some sort of alternative that would be acceptable to all of these governments, more progressive governments, and that would make the OAS a little bit less obnoxious to them, and then the system can be re-established up to a point. But you never know. I mean, it's, you know, the dislike for all of this is so intense. I'm surprised, again, going back to Peru, I'm surprised that nobody, well, the Uruguayans could try to call. I don't know who's presiding the council right now, but the Uruguayans, at least the Costa Ricans, somebody could call for a meeting, and nobody's doing it. And it's been now more than 24 hours. I mean, this is a clear issue that the Permanent Council should take out, or even a special session, and they're not doing it. I don't understand, but it's partly the dislike. Nobody wants to throw this back to the OAS because they all hate it. Now, they say they hate Almagro, but that's not true. It's the OAS that they don't like, and it's the commission that they don't like, and it's the court that they don't like. And they personify it with Almagro, but I think the problem goes beyond it. Now, again, the Americans, they could start by getting an ambassador. That would be a good idea. A permanent representative, that would be a good idea for starters. And secondly, by paying a little more attention to it. And they don't. I mean, this is part of the problem.
So I think we're almost out of time. So actually, Jorge, if you want to conclude, any concluding remarks you want to make, and I just want to, before you do that, I just want to thank you again for being here with us.
No, thank you, Rebecca, and thank you all for joining us. I know there are far more important, interesting things to watch on television, except that, of course, I don't think there are any Brazilians here, so that's kind of to be expected. But 0-0?
0-0.
Ya fueron a tiempos extra. Anyway, thank you. Goodbye. Just first, I mean, I do want to insist on the U.S. thing. In other words, it's a Mexican issue, but it's not just a Mexican issue. The Biden administration, I think, has to show a greater commitment to the defense of democracy and human rights in Latin America. I think it's doing a rather good job elsewhere in the world, not perhaps everywhere, but in general, I'm supportive. I think they believe in these things. I think our friend Ken Roth has a great deal of respect and admiration for Blinken on human rights issues in general, and I think that they're fine. But in Latin America, they're not that excited about it. They don't. It's very difficult. It's absolutely. Although, frankly, for example, on this Peruvian question, there's no migration factor involved. And although the statement is a good, strong statement, but they could do more. For example, they could call an OAS meeting, but they don't want to, because then they'll get into all sorts of fights with the Mexicans and the Argentines and everyone. So that's one. Second point, again, I think that the country where there is more challenges to democracy, partly because it's the youngest democracy in Latin America, partly because we have serious threats, is Mexico. It's a very young democracy. This is something that we should always remember. I mean, all of these other countries have more democratic experience of one sort or another than Mexico has. We just got there, and it's a long learning curve, and we have to take care of it, and we're not taking as good care as we should. But I'll stop there so we can go watch the penalty kicks, and and thank you all again for coming. It's a pleasure to see so many good friends. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.